They call it the shrouding, a fog so thick it doesn't just block your sight, it swallows your senses. At Blackwood Rock, the lighthouse is the only thing standing between the massive cargo ships and a graveyard of jagged stone. But when a freak atmospheric collapse cut the power and a ghost ship, dead in the water and weighing 200,000 tons, drifted toward the reef, the city's coast was minutes from an ecological disaster. This is the story of Storm, a blue-grey Maine Coon who could see through the whiteout. The Guardian of the Ghost Coast. Chapter 1: The King of the Crags. Blackwood Rock was a jagged tooth of granite rising out of the North Atlantic, a place where the ocean and the sky spent eternity in a violent embrace. The lighthouse perched upon it was more than just a building, it was a sentinel, a lone soldier standing guard over a graveyard of ancient shipwrecks. Below the cliffs, the water was a churning cauldron of white foam and black currents, hidden by a mist that felt as old as the earth itself. It was a landscape of raw power, where human technology was constantly eroded by the salt and the wind. In this world of stone and spray lived Storm. He was a Maine Coon of legendary proportions, 17 pounds of silver-grey muscle and fur as dense as a winter coat. With his tufted ears and paws the size of a man's palm, he looked less like a house cat and more like a lynx that had climbed out of the sea. He had been born in the bilge of a North Sea trawler, raised on the rhythm of the waves and the smell of brine. To Storm, the constant roar of the Atlantic wasn't noise, it was the heartbeat of his world, while the lighthouse keeper, Silas, relied on a complex array of diesel generators, glass lenses, and radar screens. Storm relied on the whiskers of the deep. A cat's whiskers are highly sensitive vibration sensors, and Storm's were tuned to the frequency of the ocean. He could sense a change in the barometric pressure hours before the barometer moved. And he could feel the low-frequency thrum of a ship's engine miles before it appeared on the horizon. He was the analog sensor of Blackwood Rock, a living radar system. Storm's life was one of solitary dignity. He spent his days patrolling the narrow catwalks of the lantern room and his nights curled up near the warmth of the massive rotating gears. He and Silas shared a bond formed in the silence of the coast, a partnership of few words but deep understanding. Silas provided the warmth and the food, and Storm provided the watchful eye that never blinked. They were the two guardians of the light, the old man and the grey ghost, keeping the world's trade safe from the jagged teeth of the reef. But on this particular night, the air felt different. The wind, usually a howling predator, had suddenly died down to a rhythmic, eerie whisper. The birds had vanished from the cliffs, and the sea had turned a flat, oily black. Storm stood on the balcony, his nose twitching as he tasted the air. He felt a heavy, cold weight settling over the water. A silent front was moving in, carrying with it a fog so dense it would turn the world into a tomb of white wool. Chapter 2: The Great Shrouding. The fog didn't roll in, it descended like a falling curtain. Within minutes, the horizon vanished, followed by the shore, and finally the very ground beneath the lighthouse. This was the shrouding, a rare meteorological event where the air becomes so saturated with moisture that it dampens all sound and light. It was a claustrophobic, suffocating whiteout that turned the powerful beam of the lighthouse into a useless, glowing smudge. Silas had lived on the rock for 40 years, and he had never seen anything like it. As Silas scrambled to adjust the lens, the atmosphere delivered a second, lethal blow. A fogbolt, a rare burst of static electricity generated by the friction of the dense mist, struck the primary transformer on the cliffside. The strike was silent, muffled by the fog, but the results were catastrophic. The massive rotating lens, the heart of the lighthouse, sputtered once and then ground to a halt. The great light, which had guided 10,000 ships, went dark. Silas sprinted to the basement to kick over the backup generators, his boots echoing in the damp air. He pulled the starter cord again and again, but the engines only groaned. The air was so thick with moisture that the intake filters were becoming waterlogged, starving the machines of the oxygen they needed to breathe. The backup system was choking on the very fog it was meant to fight. For the first time in a century, Blackwood Rock was a blind spot in the middle of the world's busiest shipping lane. In the lantern room, Storm felt the shift in energy. The hum of the electric motors was gone, replaced by the terrifyingly loud sound of his own breathing. He didn't panic, he simply adjusted his pupils, his yellow eyes widening until they seemed to swallow the dim red light of the emergency markers. He moved to the glass, his paws treading softly on the cold metal floor. He wasn't looking for light, he was listening to the voice of the sea, which was suddenly carrying a new, rhythmic vibration. The fog had created a sensory vacuum. Silas, back in the lantern room and gasping for air, realized the gravity of their situation. Without the light and without the foghorn, any ship in the area was sailing into a wall. They were a lighthouse that couldn't see, on a cliff that couldn't be heard, in a sea that was about to become a graveyard. Silas reached for his binoculars, but it was like looking into a bowl of milk. He was a blind man standing on the edge of a precipice. Chapter 3: The Drift of the Leviathan. 5 miles offshore, the Iron Empress was in its own private hell. The supertanker, a 300-meter island of steel carrying 5 million gallons of crude oil, had suffered a total engine failure. Without power to its screws, the massive vessel was no longer a ship. It was a drifting weight, a leviathan at the mercy of the dead current. The captain and his crew were blind in the bridge, their radar screen a chaotic mess of ghost reflections caused by the density of the shrouding. The current was pulling the Iron Empress directly toward the Blackwood Reef, a spine of rocks that could rip open a double-hulled tanker like a tin can. The crew was frantically trying to drop the emergency anchors, but at their current drift speed, the chains wouldn't bite until they were already in the shallows. They were moving toward a disaster that would not only kill them but would poison the entire coastline for a generation. They needed a bearing, a single point of reference to know which way to steer their momentum. Back on the rock, Silas was losing his mind. He knew the tanker was out there, he could hear the faint, ghostly echoes of its distress whistle, but the fog distorted the sound so much it seemed to be coming from every direction at once. He ran out onto the balcony, shouting into the whiteout, but his voice was swallowed by the mist. The cold was biting through his sweater, and the dampness was making the railing slippery and dangerous. He was a guardian who had failed his post. Then, he saw Storm. The Maine Coon wasn't huddled inside, he was perched on the very edge of the balcony railing, his body as still as a statue. Storm's tufted ears were swiveling with the precision of a satellite dish. He wasn't confused by the echoes. He was tracking the massive displacement of water, the push of the tanker's hull through the deep. Storm let out a low, guttural yowl, a sound Silas had never heard before, and fixed his gaze on a specific point in the white nothingness. Storm turned his head to the north-northeast, his body tensing as the vibration grew stronger. He knew the ship was coming, and he knew exactly where it would strike. He looked back at Silas, his yellow eyes flashing with an urgent, primal intelligence. The cat was no longer a pet, he was a living compass. Silas looked at Storm, then at the direction the cat was facing. He realized that if he didn't act now, the sound of the Iron Empress hitting the rocks would be the last thing either of them ever heard. Chapter 4: The Eyes in the Mist. "I have to light the old flame," Silas whispered, his breath hitching in his chest. At the very tip of the cliff, 50 yards from the tower, sat the original oil beacon from the 1800s. It was a primitive, manual lamp fueled by kerosene, kept as a ceremonial relic of a bygone era. If he could light it, the orange flame might be just enough to pierce the fog at the water's edge. But to get there, he had to navigate the Devil's Staircase, a narrow, winding path of jagged rocks and sheer drops that was lethal even in broad daylight. Silas stepped out onto the path, and his heart immediately sank. He couldn't even see his own boots. One wrong step to the left would send him plummeting 80 feet into the surf, one wrong step to the right would wedge his leg in a crevice. He took a tentative step and slipped, his hand catching a sharp edge of granite. He was paralyzed by the whiteout, his equilibrium shattered by the lack of a horizon. He was a prisoner on his own island. Then, a heavy, warm weight brushed against his shin. Storm had jumped from the balcony and was standing at Silas's feet, his long grey tail twitching. The cat didn't have a flashlight, and he didn't have a map, but he had the scent of the kerosene and the sound of the waves. Storm moved forward, his grey fur the only thing Silas could barely distinguish from the fog. The cat would move 5 feet, then stop and wait, his yellow eyes glowing like 2 small, guiding lanterns. The journey was a slow, terrifying dance. Storm led Silas around the slippery kelp flats where the spray made the rocks like ice. He guided him past the whistling hole, a narrow fissure in the rock where the air pressure could knock a man off his feet. Every time Silas hesitated, Storm would let out a soft MRP, encouraging him forward. The cat was navigating by a map etched into his very DNA, a map of the rock he had patrolled every night for 10 years. They reached the edge of the cliff. Silas could hear the roar of the surf just feet away, a violent, hungry sound. He reached out and felt the cold, oily metal of the old beacon. He had made it. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the matchbox, and the dampness was making every strike a failure. He was at the finish line, but the fog was trying to snuff out his last hope before it could even begin. Chapter 5: The Manual Strike. Silas fumbled with the matchbox, his fingers numb from the cold and the salt. The first match snapped. The second was too damp to strike. The third flared for a second before a gust of wind extinguished it. He was sobbing now, the sound lost in the mist. Please, he prayed, just one spark. Out in the dark, he could hear the deep, groaning sound of the Iron Empress's hull. She was close, so close he could smell the oil and the rust. Storm didn't just stand by. He moved to the base of the beacon, his thick fur providing a small, temporary windbreak for Silas's hands. The cat pressed his warm body against Silas's shins, grounding him, calming the man's frantic heart. Silas took a deep breath, shielding the matchbox with his coat and using Storm's body as a shield against the spray. He struck the match one more time. A tiny, defiant orange flame erupted. He touched the match to the kerosene-soaked wick. For a moment, there was a hiss, and then, whoosh. A towering, brilliant orange flame roared into life inside the glass housing of the old beacon. It wasn't the sterile, blue-white light of the electric lens, it was a primal, flickering fire that seemed to eat the fog around it. The orange light cast long, dancing shadows across the rocks, illuminating Silas and the giant grey cat standing at the edge of the abyss. Out on the Iron Empress, the lookout, a young man who had almost given up hope, saw it. It wasn't a lighthouse beam, it was a low, steady orange star flickering at the base of the whiteout. Light, he screamed, his voice cracking. Light at 014. The captain didn't hesitate. He ordered the emergency anchors dropped immediately, and the remaining steam in the boilers was diverted to the thrusters for one final, desperate maneuver. The anchors fell into the deep, the massive chains screaming as they tore through the winches. The ship groaned, its forward momentum fighting against the grip of the sand and the rock. The Iron Empress shuddered, 1,000,000 tons of steel coming to a violent, grinding halt. The crew stood on the deck, staring at the small orange flame in the distance. They were 50 yards from the reef, less than a minute away from a catastrophe that would have ended their lives. Chapter 6: The Light That Saved the Sea. By morning, the shrouding had lifted, pulled away by a fresh Atlantic breeze. The sun rose over a sea that was blue and peaceful, showing the Iron Empress sitting perfectly still just a stone's throw from the jagged rocks of Blackwood. The Coast Guard submersibles and tugboats arrived to find the tanker safe and its crew unharmed. The environmental disaster that had been minutes away was now just a story to be told in the bars of the mainland. Silas and Storm sat on the cliffside, watching the tugboats pull the Leviathan back to the deep water. Silas was exhausted, his hands bandaged and his face lined with the stress of the night, but he was holding a tin of the finest sardines he had in the pantry. Storm was eating with a quiet, regal focus, his grey fur drying in the morning sun. They had stood at the edge of the world and held back the dark, and the world didn't even know it yet. The story of the orange beacon spread quickly. The shipping company tried to give Silas a medal, but the old keeper simply pointed to the Maine Coon sitting on the railing of the lantern room. He told them about the cat who could see through the whiteout and the whiskers that felt the heartbeat of a ship. The company eventually commissioned a special plaque for the lighthouse entrance, featuring a cat's head silhouetted against a flame. Today, Storm has a permanent seat in the lantern room, a high, padded perch that gives him a view of the entire horizon. Silas never goes out onto the cliffs without his grey shadow, and he has installed a new, waterproof manual ignition system for the old beacon, just in case. They are the legends of Blackwood Rock, the man who strikes the match and the cat who knows where the light needs to go. As the sun sets over the Atlantic, casting a golden path across the waves. Storm narrows his yellow eyes. He can feel the distant hum of a freighter and the subtle shift of the tide. He is the king of the crags, the guardian of the ghost coast, and as long as his whiskers feel the breath of the sea, the light will never truly go out. He lets out a contented purr, a sound that harmonizes perfectly with the distant, steady rhythm of the waves. Storm was a creature of the elements, a cat who didn't need a light to find his way through the dark. He proved that when we lose our most advanced tools, we have to look to the ancient instincts of the natural world to find our way back. If Storm's bravery in the fog gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe to Paws That Saved Lives. We bring you the most thrilling stories from the edge of the world. Comment fog below if you've ever had an animal lead you home.